right now we're working on an exercise to kind of like ground everybody in the space. Everybody has a piece of paper. The first thing they did was write down what's the most important thing to them about system change. And then we waited a little while so everybody could get that down. And now they're writing, they folded that over, why is that important to you? So we're on that step. Okay. So now, once you've done that, let's move another line down. The thing that you just wrote, why that's important to you. Why is that important to you? Whatever it is you just wrote, why is that important to you? So the thing that you just wrote, why is that thing important to you? Don't worry, it does end. Yeah, so now the thing that you just wrote down, why is that important to you? And then you do it again. Why is that thing that you just wrote important to you? Dig deeper. It's there. Okay, so now who would like to share?
The original prompt was what matters to you most in system change. And I wrote the way that we treat each other is what matters most. And I thought that that matters because at the end of the day, that's all we can really control. And I thought that that matters, that if we do what we can, we've succeeded no matter what. And the last one was challenging. I thought that that matters because I want to be right in my belief that humans are good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was hard, Megan, because I had multiples.
Okay.
But as you continuously asked us to explain why, the rest of the multiples showed up. So what's the most important thing for system change? For me, are funding streams. How do we get funded? Where does that money come from? Why? Well, why are we washing blood money for others? And that led me down a path of accountability for the younger generations. And that led me down a path of why, because we need to build relationships and they need to be based on trust. Patriarchy, domination of white privilege and fragility, internalized challenges that Black, brown, indigenous, and people of colors face due to capitalism and white supremacy, and the reliance on capital, on money sources to get us out of situations.
Thank you. Anybody else?
All right, so my idea I thought of for what I think is most important system change, it was hard to choose, but I wrote quality healthcare that is accessible to everybody. So no barriers of income or location, language, gender, race, any of that. That was important to me because quality healthcare dramatically improves the quality of everybody's lives and gives us the freedom to live our lives. That is important to me because I believe it's important that everybody has the opportunity to live a healthy life, and I put an asterisk by healthy because I think health looks differently for everybody. And then that is important to me because I said, I think we're disconnected from part of our own humanity when we aren't able to properly care for our bodies.
I said the most important thing to me was recognizing our ecological and spiritual interdependence. Why that's important is because it will totally transform our relationships to ourselves and each other in a way that will make other worlds possible. Why that's important is, I said, the kind of justice I yearn for is not possible without it. And why that is important, I said, freedom and justice for all beings matters to me.
Hello. So, hi. The first change that I chose was decommodified, long-term, high-quality housing. The reason I chose that is because access to housing is the biggest barrier to escaping abuse of all forms. No one should be so poor that they can't leave their abuser. I want to uplift what our elder Roberto here said, that like capitalism robs us of community, and I think the instability of housing is the deepest one. If you don't know that you're going to be in your home in 10 years, how can you invest in your relationships with your neighbors? How can they invest in you? The reason that I specifically mention forms of abuse is because I've just seen a lot of it in my life, like in my family, in my friends' lives, and I don't want others to experience that. Yeah, and the reason why I chose that, why I care about that is I want to live in a world where cruelty is a foreign concept to the children of my children.
Thank you.
So what's important to me is self-determination. And it's important to me because I think everyone should be able to name their needs and determine how those needs are met. And that's important to me because, in survival mode, people are fighting to survive and they don't have the freedom to thrive in ways that they see fit. And that's important to me because people need the space to heal from historical and current trauma, and they can't really do that if they're in survival mode. And that matters to me because I just want to stop perpetuating trauma and violence in general.
Thank you. Maybe one more? Anybody else?
What is of concern to me is that we can live as full human beings. We can build unity and freedom. Because I am oppressed, have been a slave or descendants of a slave, and want to be free. I am not free until we are all free. Remember this, before there was capitalism in America, there was slavery. Slavery built capitalism in America.
Okay, so I think potentially why we did this exercise, as you listen to everybody speak, might have become a little bit more clear. Because no matter what anybody centered as their most important issue with system change, by the time they kept digging down, all the themes became the same. Freedom, right? Community, relationships, trust, autonomy, right? And all of those things, at the fundamental core, the reason that people, and when you do this exercise, no matter in any room, right? Even if you're doing it with the most conservative of fools, they all end up at the same place. Even if it starts out somewhere really selfish, it ends somewhere that comes from a collective sense of understanding about how we're going to move towards any kind of system change, right? And I think I wanted to center a conversation on patriarchy today with everybody else's words, because first of all, like I said when we started, knowledge doesn't come from any one source. And so it has to be collectively, too, that we figure out our way out of systems that are harming us. And so I think it becomes very clear to see that even if, you're working on this thing and I'm working on that thing and this person's working on this thing, that fundamentally at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal, right? Our strategies, our tactics, our tools, our motivations, and all of those things might be a little bit different. But if I can figure out across a room that we're all in solidarity, then we can start even a conversation about patriarchy too, which can clearly be spicy, in a place that puts us not as like in contention with one another, which is where patriarchy likes us to be, but grounding in a place where it's like, if I do something harmful, it's not because I did it, it's because my patriarchal brain potentially for a moment lapsed, and forgive me, and let's move on. So that's that. So like just kind of how this session is going to go a little bit. I want to do a little bit of like more like personal discussion, then Kaia's going to come in a little bit later and do some more like of the like heavy academic lifting for the talk. So I just kind of wanted to start, not necessarily, I'm sure everybody in here has heard like the term patriarchy. But I think it's really important for us to figure out, especially those of us working in grassroots movements who call ourselves like radical activists and all that kind of stuff, to like start to identify when patriarchy shows up in our life, how it's affecting our movement work. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of how detrimental patriarchy can be to a couple of different realms. So first, let's talk about an organization recently that many of you might have heard of called Honor the Earth. And if you've never heard of it, it's the organization that was started in the early 90s by the indigenous woman Winona LaDuke. And recently, she had to step down as the leader of her organization because in 2015, a couple of indigenous women who were a part of her collective made some claims against a man who was organizing with them. And these claims included both sexual harassment, verbal harassment, and pedophilia. And she brushed them off and said, you know, in some cases she invoked his status as a two-spirit within their community and said that like he probably had sexual relations with a minor, but that like because of his identity as a two-spirit, it wasn't as harmful, right? Brushed off the comments he was making about other people's bodies. As at one point she was quoted as saying he had verbal Tourette's, and so he couldn't be held accountable for his behavior. She went on Facebook to defend him at that point. And then when, about a week after this person made these formal complaints, they fired her and told her to not speak on it or else they would sue her. And a couple of years later, she filed a suit and was successful. And so now you have an instance in which an organization that is doing really amazing work, a person who a lot of people, including myself, Valerie, I just met her last summer and was like so honored and like humbled to be in her presence. And it detracts from the work when we don't take time to dig into the claims that people are making in this kind of system, right? So that's example one, and we'll kind of like circle back. Example two of where patriarchy often shows up is just in our like scientific and academic traditions, right? So I'm an anthropologist, and anthropology has done some very egregious things as it relates to human behavior understandings, and one of the like kind of fundamental like misunderstandings of anthropology in the early days was that there was this division, this like hardcore division between what men and what women do in a society. And they said, like, men go out and they hunt, and women stay around and take care of the kids and gather whatever little berries and stuff they can find around the house. And lo and behold, as women started being allowed into the academic tradition and then being allowed to go out into the field to do research, surprise, surprise, the understanding started to become more and more, oh, women are also hunting, right? Men are also gathering, right? And that like the diffusion of like how people's roles are taking place in these societies are not so straightforward. And actually, it turns out that something like in almost 80% of hunting-gathering societies, women were also hunting, right? And vice versa. Almost 100% of people are gathering, because hunting, if anybody knows, is actually really hard. Especially if you don't have guns and cars and like bombs to just shoot, you know, like you're tracking an animal. It does not like, you know, it's a lot of work. So actually most of what you're going to do is going to eat is going to be foraged. Then the other thing, like as I was planning this, like what we were going to say today, I'll give you two personal examples now. My partner and I started talking about deodorant. Because I don't wear like commercial deodorant, and so it's often a topic in our house, that I need to reapply, basically. So we started talking about that, yeah. Oh yes, the matriarchy will be stinky. Like we started talking about it, and he had, first of all, he was like, well, why is there a chemical difference in deodorant? I was like, well, because women aren't allowed to sweat. So they put an antiperspirant in there. So like male deodorant, if you look, usually doesn't have an antiperspirant in it. So then he started, you know, because like a lot of stuff is often very new and surprising to him about oppression. And he started looking into it. And then we discovered, even on top of that, like not discovered, but like the pink tax goes into everything, right? So like our deodorant, even it's all the same chemical compounds, is like anywhere, and our just products are anywhere from 25 to 13% more expensive than the things that are marketed towards men. And so now we have like, it's in our organizations, it's in the things that we're learning in our like academic traditions, it's in our economic system. And then it's in our personal life, because I'm going to give you one final example. When I was in my 20s, I decided to kind of like check out from the world for a while. I was a farmer, and I ran my own farm for quite a while. And before that, I went and traveled around working on various farms so I could like gain my knowledge and do that kind of stuff. And on one particular farm that I worked on here in Michigan, I spent a couple weeks there, and in the second week, well, I was supposed to spend longer, but I ended up leaving in the second week. As I was like trailing the farmer around, you know, and like he's like, you know, we're doing the work or whatever, asking a lot of questions. And at one point, he's teaching me how to use the tractor and like kind of standing behind me, and then starts giving me like a full-on back rub. He's married with a kid, like older guy, and I was like, is this happening right now? Like, maybe I'm misinterpreting what's going on right now. And like spent this, you know, I was like maybe like 25, 26, whatever. Now I would have like probably knocked him the fuck out. But I just didn't know what was going on. And like also he was in this position of authority. Like I wanted that knowledge. He was such an amazing farmer. And I had so much respect for his knowledge and what he was doing on this farm. And so we like end, and I look at this uncomfortable moment, and then I was like, well, maybe that's what didn't happen, right? Like gaslight my own self, like, oh, I'm just, like, it was something, you know? So I'm like, the next day, he's like, oh, I want to continue our tractor lesson. And like, instead of being like, hell no, I was like, well, let me do it to see if what I thought happened really happened. And we go, and it starts again, and I just jumped off the tractor and was like, oh, I actually forgot I told your wife I was going to do something else. And then, like, packed my shit up, got my dog, and we were out of there. And, like, I've spent a long time now still being like, first of all, why didn't you say anything? Second, like, there were other girls on the farm. Why didn't you warn them? Third of all, like, why didn't you tell his wife? Like, why didn't, and like still to this day, like I could, I guess, like reach out to her, but I also think I heard that he passed a couple years ago. But like, I think those kinds of stories are like, and for all kinds of people, men, women, like these stories are like so much more common, and like also the confusion about what happened, right? When people are like, well, why didn't you tell anybody? I don't know. Like, I didn't even barely understand what was going on in the moment myself, right? And also, like, I was also still so grateful because right after, like, that was kind of like one of the last farms I was going to work on before I started my own. And, like, the knowledge I gained from this person, like, was so important to me, too. Like, are you going to make a stink about a little back rub? You know, so I think, yeah, and we should, right? We absolutely should. So I think as I've gotten older, it's like part of, too, and I also know I've gotten older and I'm a lot more like able to say like, no, I don't want something, but not everybody gets there. And so then it becomes like some people are still just so shy and quiet, and it's not in their nature ever. Like conflict, especially because like we have talked about this in some of our political education at Riverwise, like that actually patriarchy also tells you that like your conflict is not okay to bring up. Theirs is, right? Whatever conflicts the like state is holding is okay. But like if you are like have any kind of confrontation with somebody else, you're a bad citizen, right? So I think when we're talking about where patriarchy shows up, it shows up everywhere in lots of different kinds of ways. It orders how we think. It orders how we're interacting with other human beings. And I think we get all of this understanding too. So I'm going to ask you guys a question because I did, when I was preparing for this too. Has anybody ever heard of Google Ngram? Yeah, so it's this cool little tool that you can go onto Google and figure out when terms became a thing in literary work. So like when, because you know Google has been on this big project to like digitize like most of the world's like whatever readings are available in the world are getting digitized by Google as much as possible. So you can put in a term and see like its first iteration of it showing up in something, and like when it became popular and like trace it through history. So I went in there and just put in patriarchy. And through the like 1800s, it's pretty flat. Like the first kind of iterations of it were coming from people who were like anthropologists in the early days. And so it's all often related to like how they're thinking about how a kinship system is ordered around the world. And so you see it in that same sense where like this society is a patriarchy where da, 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 da. And then in about the mid-1800s, you see like a couple being written by early abolitionists, right? And the first one I found was by a woman named Sarah Moore Grimke, who was an early abolitionist in Charleston, South Carolina. And her father was a slave owner, and she had the opportunity to go to like Pennsylvania and meet some Quakers, and then she was like, oh yeah, I thought this shit was wrong. And then she started writing about it and became an abolitionist. And then it kind of like lays flat. Like those are kind of the instances in which you're going to see terms like patriarchy show up, and it's like way down there by the bottom. And then in like 1965, the term patriarchy blows up. Anybody have any guesses as to why a term like patriarchy would blow up in between like the 1960s and 1970s? Sure.
Well, the white feminist movement was becoming bigger in the United States.
The feminist movement, Well, sorry?
Women were going to college.
Women started to be accepted into colleges and universities. So just like previously when we figured out that like gender roles aren't based because women had started to get allowed into anthropology departments, patriarchy as a concept starts to become something that people are that you see being written about prolifically, because like typically what people do when they go into an academic situation is write about what matters to them the most, right? And so not only was there the white feminist movement, there was the Black Power movement, right? There was civil rights, there was like the freedom movements going on, and then women are now given a chance to like represent their side of the story, right? And so you see a like proliferation, and that has just continued. Like now the term patriarchy is now like went, and it's a really it's literally almost like overnight this thing, there was not a gradual move towards that. And I just, like, a funny quote I found while I was looking all of this, when Yale decided, because it was like Ivy Leagues kind of that helped like push a lot more like integration of men and women in their schools. The president of Yale said that his decision to do so was not about what Yale could do for women, but what women could do for Yale, right? Because they recognized, right, because patriarchy and capitalism and all of those things are like enmeshed. And so he recognized that like a lot of his students were leaving and not coming to Yale to go to co-ed institutions. And so let's become co-ed so that we can capitalize off of women, not because we actually care about their education or anything. And then, you know, so clearly we see it in movement work. We can think about the Marxist movement as well, right? Like a lot of understandings of Marxism in the early days were just that we are all aligned because we're all workers. There's a problem with that argument, right? Right? What if you're shut out of the labor economy because of your gender? So then at what point do you get counted in the like telling of where actually we're all aligned? If I'm making less than you on the dollar, if I'm actually not allowed to do certain work, right? And if we're prioritizing certain forms of work over others. And I actually, I saw Jonina like emphatically shake her head, yes. When we talk about the value of women's labor in a movement, we could also talk about the Black Panther Party. And how patriarchy also gets in its own way a lot of times. So, right, like there's a common narrative about the Black Panther Party that it was all based on toxic masculinity and that women were oppressed and that there was this like horrible relationship between men and women. And stories are often way more nuanced than that. And so I first of all highly encourage everybody to go. Riverwise did a podcast with a woman named Yasmin Majid, who's a Black Panther from Brooklyn, New York. And she spoke with one of our homies, Kari Frazier, for our podcast, and speaks about some of the struggles of being a woman in the Black Panther movement, but also speaks about the power that she held within that movement. And part of actually the state's patriarchal understanding of how power was led, when they went after all of the like so-called male leaders of the Black Panther Party, they forgot that it was led by women as well. And so rather than, like, so they cut off a lot of the legs from the men by all the incarceration and the murder, but because they had undervalued the role of women, at the point at which they were doing all of that, I read an estimate that 2/3 of the Black Panther Party were women, right? And so when you see the Black Panther Party still alive today, it's because it valued women's work, right? And power and the ability to be powerful. So I think all of that is to say, when we're thinking in our work, okay, how do we move beyond some of those things and we think about this concept? Is everybody here familiar with the idea of prefiguration? Yeah. Not. Okay. So when you're thinking about how you bring about system change, it can come in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways that, like, especially like radical activists like to come about it is through actually living out things as if you are already in a space where that is happening. So prefiguration would be like creating an autonomous or a liberated zone to kind of play with, like, what if we don't have money, what does that look like? Or if we don't all have homes, what does that look like? Or having an urban farm, like to see, like, what does food security look like if we don't rely upon the capitalist economy? It's like playing with things like consensus process as an alternative to like voting process or like representative process. So you say, I represent myself, nobody else represents me in how we're going to make these political decisions. And I think when we're thinking about moving beyond patriarchy, prefiguration becomes really important. Because I think some of the things that people have done to try and play with the world and how we order things and all these, it's not perfect, but it leads us to like greater understandings of what our institution, our organization, our values, like our personal lives, how all of those things could look if we play around with it. Like, we don't know, right? And so, like, I think one of the places, though, in which we often get stumped in prefiguration is because patriarchy has taught us over and over again that the concept of hierarchy is a bad thing, and always a bad thing, right? And it's because the way in which it shows up in capitalism and in patriarchal societies is just like how this room is right now, or before actually, because now it's a little bit less. But like, you know, when you come into a space and everything is directed like a pyramid towards one central point, and then we forget that I might know the most about this right now, but you might know the most about that. And so if we only organize a hierarchy around like a charismatic character, or somebody who just talks the loudest, or like somebody who just stepped up in that moment, and we don't actively try and look within our communities and see, okay, who's the best at baking the biscuits? You do that. Who's the best at ensuring that the children are okay? Who's the best at whatever it is, right? And so then what it is that you make the role in any given moment, right? The function, the like connection, like the whatever it is. And so when we started out and everybody was talking about how do you build trust? How do you build community? Where do you build relationships? And it's by making and ensuring that power, because it's always going to exist. Power is not going to go away. Power dynamics will exist in any kind of interaction you have with anybody. So by pretending that they're not going to exist, right, we're not doing ourselves any favors, right? And a lot of that is just because of the trauma that we've all endured because of how power shows up in a patriarchal, capitalist society, right? Like, but I think that like kind of playing with our notions of power, how it shows up, calling it out when you see it so that it's transparent. Like, in this moment, I am going to take power. It's like almost like the idea of like having a talking stick, right? That you're like signaling it so that you also know that sometimes your power is going to go away, and that's okay, right? Because when it comes time for you to step up, it'll come back to you. Yeah. So I think as we're thinking about how it shows up in our spaces, when we need to address it, right, patriarchy, and what we do to counteract it is all going to be wrapped up in these things. First of all, being transparent about our own relationships with power and how we want them to show up. You know, so for example, I could give you a personal example from the magazine. So Riverwise is run by a collective of volunteers. Some people are like on contract status. And then there's like just a very small staff who's actually getting paid to do that work. So most of our work relies on volunteer work. And we use this language. So Riverwise is a heavily prefigured kind of space, right? Like we think about prefiguration. We think about what like power dynamics look like within our space. But often we also have to remember with prefiguration that we're still in this version of the world, right? So I want this like amazing world where all of these things can happen that we talked about, right? Everybody has health care. Everybody is like able to trust. We can rely upon our faith that humans are good and all of that. but under this system, we're not there yet, right? And so we also have to remember that as well. And I think sometimes we have to make these decisions to signal out where power lies so that somebody can be held accountable, right? Because somebody also mentioned accountability be really important. And in capitalist systems, there's often the obscuring of who's accountable for all of this, right? It's why naming powerful people rather than saying they're out to get us, you say Betsy DeVos is out to get us, right? Like specifically, you know? So and I think that that's important on our side too. Naming who is important in a room is important, even to grassroots movement, right? It's why when you look back in history, we often only know the names like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we know a lot of the male names. Yeah. We don't often know a lot of the women names in that space, and that's just starting to become a thing. Once again, as female historians start to dig into the history, or women's studies become more important. And then you start to say, we just saw a powerful documentary the other day made by Josie Harding about Dorothy Moore. And she was, by all rights, more powerful than Dr. King. But nobody knows her name, So I think as we start to think about what ways those things are showing up in our organization, and how it changes what we think about history, or even what we're doing right now, to kind of center some of that. And I'll shut up now. And I don't know, Chaia, if we want to have questions first, or if you want to jump into your portion.
Well, I have it's not academic, it's sort of an intellectual kind of way to frame some of what you've been so beautifully talking about that I think might be useful if people are open and willing. And I made a bunch of visuals because I'm a visual thinker and learner. So if folks are open to that, I might just move through it. It's just sort of literally a formalization of every single thing, the amazing thing that you just talked about, Megan. And what I want to do first is I want to tie it to the panel yesterday. For people who were there, we were talking about dialectics and how the revolutionary process is really people moving through a series of never-ending contradictory forces or categories. And we talked yesterday about, for Marx, the proletariat worker, for social ecology, becomes really hierarchy in general against non-hierarchy, or society, nature. But I think, in this case, we're looking at social ecology's dialectics. We look at society and nature, and as we could talk at some point, those are very gendered category, and they're very cultural categories. The categories emerged in a Eurocentric worldview, and a general understanding of hierarchy and non-hierarchy. And often when people are in a movement space that's anarchist or revolutionary, people assume, well, if I'm in name anti-hierarchical, then everything that's going to happen in our organization, of course, is going to be non-hierarchical. We've got it. And what I want to add is that social ecology, and this is Chaia Heller, social ecology, not Bookchin, he never talked about the general in the particular, that for me, the general dialectical contradictions in social ecology surface when we move from the general to the particular. So a general principle like non-hierarchy has to be particularized to be anti-patriarchy, or we could call that feminism. That the particularization has to be explicit, has to be transparent, has to be brought to consciousness, has to be stated. It can't be implicit in the generalized form. Why is that? It's because if we don't front load in our organizations, in our organizational cultures, mechanisms and systems for addressing and making these particular forms of hierarchy apparent, they will emerge and they'll create episodic crises that can bring down really important organizations and drive people out. Brain drain, drive women, queer people, folks with disabilities, people dealing with racism inside of movements can drive really good people out. And so what I wanted to say is what we're talking about here in the prefigurative moment is if you're working in a prefigurative movement that's anti-hierarchical, you have to be aware that you're going to experience intra-movement contradictions. It means contradictions not between your movement and the world. That's what we usually tend to focus on the most, but also the contradictions that happen within our organizations. Again, when we look at the contradiction between the principle of human liberation or non-hierarchy in general, and how it stands in contradiction with the way racism as a form of hierarchy, white supremacy, inevitably surfaces in our organizations, and how cis heteronormative patriarchy inevitably surfaces in our organizations because we internalize all of those values and systems and beliefs, even if we don't like them. And ableism, and the list literally here could go on and on and on. And here you have a woman saying WTF. And so what I call this problem that we're really looking at is DLS. It's in the psychological manual, the DSM-6, and it's dirty laundry syndrome. What happens is that people are in movements and a piece of dirty laundry shows up that didn't get quite cleaned or dressed on the laundry line, is just hanging out there, and people become terrified that if we address this, we are going to show our dirty laundry to the world, our organization will be crushed. And so what happens is we end up living with a dirty laundry non-washing machine that lives at the center of our movements. And here you have a woman or a queer person saying WTF and not again. Like, are you kidding me? Not again. Here we are. It's a spin cycle, a never-ending spin cycle, where now we're completely exasperated, and this woman might be on her way out. And you might never know why she left the organization. A lot of BIPOC women do not feel comfortable voicing their concerns and their experiences and making dissonance. They don't feel that people will validate their experience or listen. A lot of white women as well have the feeling that there's not an actual mechanism in place or way to deal with with incidents of hierarchy that emerge in our movements. And so what happens is the spin cycle, we move from denial, where if somebody does bring a claim to an organization, often the organization will minimize as a form of denial, say it's not really happening, or you're kind of misinterpreting things, or it's not a big problem because it's just a first offense, get over it and kind of like move on. And then there's distancing, which is in some ways often people who bring problems to organizations, people kind of want to step back from them because they don't want to be associated with the problem. And the problem often becomes the targeted person rather than the person who's making the problem. And deride. People can often start to actually deride people who make problems and become the squeaky wheel in organizations and say, she's really, really crazy, or that person's just sort of obsessed, or what have you. And finally, deflect. And that's draw attention away from the problem and just try to move on and minimize, and deflect. The problem isn't the person who's the perpetrator. The problem is the person who's actually targeted. And so how do we get out of this never-ending spin cycle? One, we should always expect and prepare for dirty laundry. The prefigurative moment will always be filled with dirty laundry. There's no way we're going to all be wearing clean clothes all the time. I'm using this laundry metaphor because it's kind of like women's work historically to clean up the mess. And I think it's kind of ironic and funny. So always expect, just like you do in your daily life, that there will be dirty laundry. Somebody's going to throw a pair of dirty pants on you, or they put their dirty hands on your shoulder while you're working in a farm and giving you a massage. Now you've got some dirty laundry that you're wearing. What do you do with that? Expect it and prepare for it. And how do we do it? And I would say right now, our existing strategies are really insufficient. Our existing strategies for dealing with dirty laundry are cancel culture. I won't even go. You all know way too much. The part of the backlash, the Me Too movement, was this thing called cancel culture, where in many ways, really valid criticisms and valid claims of being harassed or abused become trivialized. And again, the targeted person is targeted as having canceled someone. Often we have call out culture. And I won't even go into that one. It's very similar to cancel culture. Restorative justice is absolutely necessary, but it needs to be institutionalized and ritualized and routinized within organizations. And I'll talk about that in a moment. There's conflict resolution. Sometimes these issues are not conflicts. A man coming up and massaging you while you're working and on a farm is not a conflict. That is an abuse of power, male power and position. It's an act of domination. It's not a conflict. And it's not personal either. So a lot of conflict resolution work can actually have a paradoxical effect by personalizing an issue, making it emotional, psychological, interpersonal. You guys don't get along, etc. Some things are not conflicts. There are many, many conflicts, but not everything is a conflict. Finally, we give bystander trainings, and these are cool. But again, if they're just episodic trainings, they're not routinized and part of organizational cultures. And then when people do diversity, equity, inclusion, this has become part of corporate America. Almost every corporation has a diversity, equity, inclusion committee of some kind. They throw a little bit of money at, and they don't tend to do a whole lot. So what do? Or first, why? Why does the dirty laundry keep showing up? And why do these strategies that have been developed, in the last few decades, why do they not really work? One is the truth is people have not really done the consciousness raising work and the educational work on an ongoing basis to raise awareness, to raise consciousness to the point where someone can say, oh, wow, somebody's massaging my shoulders. This feels fucked up. And here's who I'm going to go to and talk about. And here's the mechanism for addressing this. So lack of awareness and consciousness as an institutionalized practice within organizations. Two, again, people are afraid of dirty laundry, fear of exposing internal problems within organizations and movement to the public. Our movements are fragile. Our movements are vulnerable. The right loves it when we make a mess. They feast on it and weaponize that. And so it's really, it's a valid fear, but the fear has to be, in a sense, energized into the right direction, away from deflection and towards addressing the dirty laundry in a really effective and direct way. Three, sort of the same thing as fear of damaging our organizations and movements. And four is repeat, because the spin cycle never freaking ends. Coming to the end here. So those other strategies also aren't fabulous because they really address episodic crises that emerge. And if you've been in an organization or a movement long enough, you know exactly what I'm saying, that a crisis emerges, or maybe one incident happens and is reported, and there's another one, and there's another one, and now it blows up. There's a huge crisis. People rally to get out their diversity, inclusion, equity committee, to get out they go to all of those skills, they address it, but again, then they let it go. And there's no ongoing kind of culture change of the organization. So I'm saying we need to move from episodic crisis management to organizational preparedness and readiness. And that means we need to commit to ongoing consciousness raising and education in our communities, in our movements, in our organizations. And this means creating study groups, having queer people, men, women, folks with disabilities, old people, young people, really study what are the kinds of power dynamics that surface in our movements that really are potentially injurious forces that are surfacing all the time. How do we commit to conscious raising groups and educational study groups that's ongoing and at the top of our priority list? 2 is commit to creating a transparent process for addressing the inevitable incidents of cis heteropatriarchal sexism, to have a formal practice in place that where you know who the point person is or the point people are to go to bring your concerns to, and to know that you have a system of actionable norms. Not just that you have norms for what counts for domination and abuse of power and movements, but you know how they're going to be addressed. And ultimately, what I want to say is that in social ecology, freedom is not just a principle. And outside of social ecology, freedom is an ideal. It's not just a static ideal. It's an actionable, formalized process at best. Freedom has to be formalized in a very transparent and explicit way. And one movement that to me that I've heard about that is the most kind of exciting, and I'm sure very, very limited and contradictory too, is the Kurdish Women's Liberation Movement, Kurdish Women's Freedom Movement, where you have women, there's a co-chair system where at every level of organization in the movement, there's a man and a woman, which is problematic because there's many, many people who do not conform to the gender binary, and they have yet to really address that. So that's their work. But to have a co-chair system, maybe it would be you'd have a queer person and a cis person and a cis woman. I don't know, maybe a 3-chair system. But that at every level of organization, you have people in place who are there to keep their eyes on the prize of dealing with dirty laundry. 2, you have point people who are recallable and who are trained and have skills to address people when they bring a problem to them. You have, again, transparent norms and consequences. Like with the case with Winona LaDuke, had there been something in place where the person who was offending the norms or transgressing norms was said, okay, you did this, here's a warning, and it's written or it's in person, and you have this amount of time to fix this. If something is fixable, some things are not fixable. Some offenses are absolutely unacceptable and you need to be asked to leave an organization. That happens. But really important norms as well as consequences. And then again, repeat, because the spin cycle never ends, is never ending work. And ultimately, why this matters within the broader revolutionary project is that when we have positions, which are our ideals, our principles, that are, for instance, they're general, and it could be like non-hierarchy. There's always going to be people who have different positionalities. They're raced differently. They're sexed and gendered differently. They are able-bodied differently. They live in a different part of the world. They're classed differently. Everybody's positionality will affect what their non-hierarchy looks like, what their level of freedom and what their expression of freedom needs to look like. And so you have to have a dialectic, reciprocal relationship between position and positionality, where people are working, people of different positionalities are working together, again, within education and consciousness raising groups, and talking about how do their positions, their principles always become retained, always retained in their subject identities, their personal identities, and their missions for liberation for themselves and the group they're part of. And if we don't have that, then the agenda for our revolution will be woefully, woefully inadequate. And we will just always be dealing with problems of positionality and power abuse among folks of different abuse of power for positioned differently. So the agenda can only be as free and as liberatory as is our dialectic between position and positionality, as is our conversation that's ongoing, as is our formalization of freedom that's ongoing. And we need the agenda because the agenda is what will create the policies that we'll use to govern ourselves in the good society, when we can actually live in general assemblies and meet together as citizens, stateless citizens, in a capitalism-free society, to actually keep upping the ante for what freedom really looks like. And I just want to end with a short vignette, which is that for 22 summers in a row, I had this enormous privilege of living in a community at the Institute for Social Ecology. We were like a anarchist summer camp, and we'd be all living together. And during my first, 5, 6 years, I noticed that during the first week of the program, there would be an incident where some guy usually would do something heinous to some woman, and they'd come to me. I let it be known that I was a therapist, psychotherapist, and I'm little. I was young, and I think as a little teeny woman in my 20s, I looked like a safe person to go to, or safe enough. So women would come to me and say, I can't believe what fucking just happened. Women were being sexually harassed. Sometimes there were actually predatory incidents. Sometimes there were racist incidents that were heinous as well. Or sometimes they're all together. And I would, be putting out the fires myself. And people said, well, you're a shrink, so why don't you do this? And after a few years of this, I thought, I think we need to have a different approach to this. And I said, let's have an anti-oppression workshop that is at the beginning of every program we do. They were 4 to 6 week programs. We get them all living together on a mountain in Vermont for the summer, studying revolutionary politics. And we would start the whole program with a 2-day workshop on anti-oppression. And we would literally talk about and present all the scenarios that generally would happen in the first week, and talk about how we would address them. We had point people, me and a few other people. I was the only queer person there for 22 summers there. I was the only queer faculty, often the only queer person, believe it or not. This world was different. This was from 84 to 2004. But over time, we saw, and every year we'd make our anti-oppression workshop better. We'd fine tune it. And over time, what we really saw was a huge change, that the end of week 1 wouldn't be like, oh shit, where I always joke, say we'd go from the Institute for Social Ecology to becoming the Institute for Social Apology, where we were saying to people, oh my God, we're so sorry. And we would have a community meeting every week, and we would bring up these issues that people were bringing to the committee that was looking at sort of community health, mental and physical health, and social health. And we would address them in the community meeting, and we would have norms and consequences. And it really improved the quality of our programming. And that's just one case among so many cases I know of people trying to figure out ways to structurally keep these ways of addressing power dynamics that will inevitably emerge in movements. And I'll just end by saying, we shouldn't feel defeated by this. It's actually, I think, should be or could be inspiring. For me, it became literally like a challenge, like every year, like how are we going to really get ahead of this time? It was actually a growing curve, and it was really a learning curve, and that for everybody involved, we realized this pedagogy of becoming aware of power dynamics in a group of people was allowing us to grow our capacity to think of ourselves as organizers. And people took this out of the ISC back to their own communities. A lot of people continued this sort of work in their organizations, and it was kind of amazing. So that is what I wanted to share with you all, and I hand it back to you, Megan.
Thank you. So just real quick, Mason, how much time do we just have like 5 minutes left?
You can do like another 15.
Okay, cool. Because Yes, we will keep it to 15. So this is going to be kind of a like rapid fire, then a little bit more than we wanted it to be. But I do want us to spend a little bit of time at the end of this actually thinking and reflecting on our own organizations, and doing a little bit of sharing out on that. So what I'm also going to ask, since we've all been sitting for a little while, if you're able to do so, let's stand up and find a seat next to somebody you don't know. If you're not able, stay where you are. We'll come to you. But if you are able, and if you're in the Zoom, I'm sorry that we don't have teleportation yet for you to get somewhere else.
We're working on it.
But we're working on it. I'm going to just ask, like, from each group, like, maybe to just, delegate one person to kind of give us, like, what's your biggest hot take? What are you going to leave here with, right? Like, what understanding either came out of, like, what's showing up and what do we want? And, like, what are some examples and how do we, like, interact with those? So, yeah, and we'll just kind of popcorn it real quick. I'm going to start over here. And I'll kind of call out as well as possible.
Yeah. I feel like this is very relevant for everyone in our group, so thank you very much for providing something like this. A lot of us are dealing with issues either currently or have in the past within our groups, and there's definitely a lot of overlap and relatability, and it was mixed in our group. Some of us had like specific frameworks to follow, and then some of us don't have anything within ours.
Yeah.
So I feel like overall, to me, the relatability was really powerful.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of seeing that like everybody is at least encountering these things within their spaces. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
So I want to echo the relatability piece. One of the things that came up for us, we actually didn't talk about any like organizations as in like workplaces or organizing. It actually distilled down to organizing within our homes and intimate spaces. So for some of us, it was about our partnerships and how patriarchy can show up even in queer relationships, and how that can kind of take us by surprise, and how some of the resources that are available to maybe hetero relationships are not as available for us to unpack that, and how that shows up. But even when folks are building intentional communities, so not just these intimate romantic relationships, but also building out intentional communities and seeing what does it look like to have accountability systems, structures within your daily life, from household chores and finances, and making sure that people feel like every part of who they are, whether they be disabled or have different skills, can be supported and considered as valuable in the home, was really our key takeaway. And when we think about these organizations, there's a lot to still unpack there, but it was a really good conversation.
Awesome. So yeah, if you couldn't hear in the Zoom, Meg was saying, like, centering also not just in your organization, but in your home spaces, and like interpersonal relationships, making sure that you're centering all kinds of different dynamics, and even highlighting that potentially there are more tools and tips and tricks for this if you're in a heteronormative space, and that like centering other like disabled, queer perspectives is going to be helpful as we move on. I think that's a like good place to kind of like wrap us up and finish. Because what I was hearing when I kind of went around to just bring some of those in is that like one of the struggles that somebody was talking about was that like if some kind of harm does happen and you are saying that you're like your organization has these communal beliefs, but everything is driven by one person, and then something happens, you can't go to that one person who's causing the harm, right? Like you don't ask like the lamb to tell the wolf to stop biting it, right? And so, first of all, having a really powerful tool that I saw when we were going through an issue here in Detroit that we still want to work on is a pod map. Who are the people that you can go to who are safe, who are like diffuse? So yes, I'm the managing editor of Riverwise, but if I did something, who could somebody go and talk to, right? Or Valerie and I did something, right? Like really making sure that there are other names in that hat that like everybody trusts, right? That you could go to when something happens. And then also the mention of like whose knowledge is seen as valuable and what boundaries are we having around like how we establish power in a space. Like, so like figuring out really well what it is that is acceptable and is okay is going to take some time. It's going to take, because somebody brought up, oh, well, there was a character in this organization who was real flirtatious. But like inherently and naturally, flirtation isn't a horrible or bad thing, right? Like it's only because we're so scared right now because the power isn't it's hiding itself. And so we're not sure when somebody's doing something if it's going to be harmful or not. But in a perfect world, like flirt all day. Give me coy. I love, like let's do that. But we're so scared right now. And I think this is why it's so important too, especially like all of the things that Chaia spoke about, but really front loading that work in the beginning so that it doesn't detract from the work later, so that it doesn't. So, because as we've said, inevitably these things are going to arise. We are not in the world yet where all of these things are figured out. So at least having some processes in place as you begin, understanding really well as you begin, and knowing too, like even to your point, that when somebody does something that is anger, fearful, scary, a lot of times those are trauma responses. So I'm not saying that we have to take and coddle people who are doing violent or horrible things, and sometimes they do just need to go, and that also has to be a conversation, but also recognizing that a lot of times people doing things, it's really just a trauma response, right? And it could also be if you have those things front-loaded. It's like when you misgender somebody, rather than making it a whole big case, you say, oh, I'm sorry, and you say the right gender, and then you move the fuck on. And sometimes that's all that's needed, but if you don't have a process in place for it, you get stuck at that trauma, right? Or at your mistake or your mishap. And so I think that's why, like, having some, and there's so many resources out there. I wanted to, like, we had wanted to put together, like, some more resources. We just kind of, like, ran out of time. But just a couple of good places that you can look for, like, just transition tools. You could check out the Hive Fund. Has, like, lots of really good resources on there that you can go through organizationally. Hive, like beehive. Hive. Yeah, Hive Fund has a lot of good and Friends of the Earth also has a lot of good like tools. And then these days there's also I'm blanking on the name, but I can look at it when we're done. There's a lot of good like abolitionist resources too for like how you start to speak about those organizationally. You don't have to do it on your own. You don't have to recreate the wheel, and it's gonna be messy. It's gonna look messy because right now it is messy. We haven't all still yet decided we trust each other. So transformative stuff doesn't work unless we all trust one another. So we got to get there, like you said, first. But we can do it, and this room and all the people on the Zoom are showing us that people are thinking about it. So,
speaking of Zoom, we do just have 2 comments from breakouts, but I was just going to put the chat up here. I don't want to take too much time, but they said one was experiences in a workplace where older white men have a higher position, women are doing the clerical work, men decide the culture. And the other was that, which I think is important to name here, especially that in organizing and movements, there's a heavy reliance on academic knowledge, definitions and schools of thought that are often taken for granted as common knowledge. And for folks without formal education, it can be tricky to navigate this. So another reminder this is why, to name things in terms and define terms.
Both of these things are why too, because I heard this echoed too. So just one final comment too. This is why one of the things that Chaia mentioned is so important too, and we do this at Riverwise as well. Doing political education within your organization is probably one of the greatest and most fulfilling things you can do. And it doesn't mean that so when we do our political eds, it's our group. There's not like any one person who's running it, right? Because the education comes organically, it comes from the streets, it comes from higher education as well. but we have our community leaders and all of those kinds of people run those kinds of things. And so making sure that, yes, you are absolutely not only valuing and centering one form of knowledge, like transfer, and holding political educations. Like, it might sound like, more work. Now I got to organize another meeting. But it will be the most valuable thing you do.
They end up being really high.
And they're really great, high vibe. Yeah.
When we're done, I'm sorry, we gotta go home.
Yeah, we got to kick people out. Yeah.
But they appreciate the conversation, and always we walk away feeling like, oh, that was some high five goodness. And
Yes.
we'll unpack all that shit. Okay.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just end on, like, we can all do it. Smash the patriarchy. Woo.
Could I make a last comment that I want to throw out there?
Sorry, say that again.
I just wanted to ask if I could make a last sort of comment, which is that my philosophical sort of take on teaching revolutionary ideas is that you always want to leave people not with holding a vessel of sorrow and frustration, but to open a door. And so, I didn't say who I was when I got here, but I've been teaching for 40 years with the Institute for Social Ecology, working a lot on these issues, and that I want this conversation to continue. And if you as an individual or as a person working in an organization would like to consult with me, maybe me and Megan could team up and do a cool consult with you and talk about how to develop structures within your organizations, how to create norms and expectations that are actionable. We would love to do that. And just to say, I teach a class that's coming in the fall called the Philosophy and Politics and Social Ecology. Is going to have a big section on this, positionality, and how to actualize our potential to create really non-hierarchical organizations that are not just hypothetically and generally hierarchical, but actually take on the particular work that we've been talking about. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chaia.